Diesel costs blood these days. When Annie hauled a dozen draft horses onto her family's dying acreage instead of a shiny new machine, the whole county braced for her foreclosure. They called her crazy. They called her finished. 6 months later, the pumps ran dry, and nobody was laughing. Black smoke belched from the exhaust stack of the International Harvester, thick and smelling of burnt oil and catastrophic failure. Annie stood in the dirt, wiping a streak of grease from her forehead, as the engine gave one final, agonizing, metallic shriek. Then came the silence. It wasn't a peaceful quiet. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a farm bleeding out. She climbed up the side of the machine, her boots slipping on hydraulic fluid. Popping the access panel required 2 violent hits with the heel of her hand. Inside, the reality was worse than the sound had suggested. A rod had snapped, punching a jagged hole straight through the block. Shards of cast iron sat pooling in dark, sludgy oil. This wasn't a repair. This was a funeral. Harvest was 3 weeks away. 300 acres of winter wheat stood in the fields, drying out, waiting to be cut. Annie didn't cry. Crying was a luxury for people who had a safety net. Instead, she walked back to the farmhouse, the soles of her boots heavy with dry earth. The kitchen table was buried under a snowdrift of envelopes, past due notices, final warnings, utility bills printed in aggressive red ink. She pulled out the leather-bound ledger her father had kept, its spine cracking as she flipped to the current month. The numbers were brutal. Seed costs had climbed. Fertilizer had tripled. Now, she needed a combine. A used one, a machine reliable enough to actually bring in a crop without spontaneously combusting, would run her $200,000. She had $4,000 in the checking account. Arthur, the loan officer at the regional bank, wore a tie that cost more than Annie's truck. He sat across from her the next morning, steepled his manicured fingers, and looked at her paperwork with the practiced, sympathetic wince of a mortician. "Annie, I knew your father," Arthur said, his voice soft, padded with fake regret. He was a good man, a hard worker. "I'm not here for a eulogy, Arthur. I'm here for an equipment loan," Arthur sighed, tapping a silver pen against his desk. "The debt-to-income ratio just isn't there. You've had 2 bad yield years. The collateral you're offering, the land itself, is already heavily leveraged. Approving a $200,000 note for a combine, it's financial suicide for the bank, and frankly, for you. If I don't harvest, you get the land anyway," Annie said. Her voice remained flat, devoid of the panic clawing at her throat. "Is that the play? Starve me out? Auction the acreage to Greg next door?" Arthur stiffened. "That's entirely uncalled for. It's just math, Annie." She stood up, scraping the wooden chair backward across the polished floor. "Math is going to starve half this county in 5 years. Thanks for your time." Driving back, the needle on her fuel gauge hovered dangerously close to empty. Diesel was sitting at an all-time high, eating into profit margins like a parasite. Every tractor, every truck, every generator on the farm demanded a constant, liquid diet of cash. She didn't go straight home. She took the county highway north, pulling into the dirt lot of the regional livestock auction. She didn't know why she was there. Maybe she just needed to be around people whose hands were as dirty as hers. The smell of the auction barn hit her like a physical force, a dense mixture of sawdust, manure, cheap coffee, and desperation. Farmers sat in the bleachers, their faces deeply lined, watching as cattle were run through the ring. But Annie's attention drifted to the holding pens out back. That was where she saw them. A dispersal sale from a logging outfit up north had dumped 12 Clydesdales into the pens. They were massive, heavily muscled beasts, their coats a mix of bay and roan, feathers thick around their hooves. They stood with a calm, stoic presence amid the chaos of the auction yard. Annie walked up to the rusted pipe fencing. One of the geldings, a towering bay with a white blaze, lowered his head and blew a soft, warm breath against her jacket. The sheer power radiating from the animal was undeniable. A ton of bone and muscle. A gravelly voice broke her focus. Going to slaughter, mostly. Annie turned to see an old handler leaning on a pitchfork, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. Logging company went bankrupt, liquidating everything. Nobody buys draft horses anymore. Too slow. Too much work. Dog food companies will bid them out at 60 cents a pound. Annie looked back at the horses. Her mind, rigidly trained to calculate diesel gallons per hour, maintenance schedules and interest rates, suddenly pivoted. She closed her eyes. She needed to pull a header. She needed to pull a thresher. Before engines, wheat was harvested by horse-drawn, ground-drive equipment. It was slow. It was back-breaking. It required a team of operators. But it didn't require a drop of diesel, and it didn't require a $200,000 loan from a man in a silk tie. "When do they run through the ring?" Annie asked. The old man squinted at her. "Hour from now. You ain't seriously thinking about it." "How much for the whole string? 12 horses? At meat price? Maybe 10 grand. Why?" Annie gripped the cold steel pipe of the fence. $10,000. She had 4 in cash. She could sell her ruined combine for scrap, pawn the backup generator, and empty the emergency fund. It would leave her with absolutely nothing. 0 operating capital. Just grass, water, and 12 beating hearts. "I'm going to register for a paddle," Annie said, walking away. Greg's $80,000 heavy-duty pickup idled at the end of Annie's driveway. He sat in the cab, the air conditioning blasting, elbow resting on the open window frame. A smirk played across his face as he watched the rusty livestock trailer back into the farmyard. When the ramp dropped and the first Clydesdale backed out, its massive hooves striking the metal grate like thunderclaps, Greg actually laughed out loud. He cut the engine, stepped out of his truck, and leaned against the fence. "You opening a petting zoo, Annie?" Greg called out, his voice carrying over the wind. Annie didn't look at him. She unclipped the lead rope, guiding the massive gelding into the holding paddock. "I'm farming, Greg." "With what? Antique lawn ornaments?" Greg shook his head, pulling a toothpick from his pocket. "I heard the bank shut you down. There's no shame in selling, Annie. I told you I'd give you fair market value for the land. Save you from embarrassing yourself." "Fair market value minus 20%, you mean?" Annie shot back, leading the second horse down the ramp. "I'm not selling. You're going to harvest 300 acres of wheat with horses? You're out of your damn mind. You don't even have the equipment." "I'll find it." "You'll fail," Greg stated, stating it not with malice, but with cold, cynical certainty. "By October you'll be foreclosed, these beasts will be starved, and the bank will sell me this dirt for pennies. Suit yourself." Greg climbed back into his truck, the massive diesel engine roaring to life, drowning out the nervous nickers of the horses. Annie watched him drive away, a plume of black smoke trailing behind his exhaust. Her hands shook slightly as she gripped the lead rope. He was probably right. The math was impossible. The labor was unthinkable. But she had made her bet. The next 3 weeks stripped away any romantic illusions Annie might have harbored about working with draft animals. It was not a picturesque painting of agrarian harmony. It was a brutal, physically devastating war of attrition. She spent $3,000 she barely had acquiring a rusted, 70-year-old ground drive binder and a stationary thresher from a collector 3 counties over. It took 5 days of soaking bolts in penetrating oil and welding fractured steel to make them functional. But the machinery was the easy part. The real battle was the hitch. Hooking up a 12-horse team required a mastery of leather, chains, and geometry that Annie did not possess. The horses were trained to log, pulling in pairs or fours. They were not accustomed to the complex, shifting dynamics of a massive field hitch. The first time she tried to line them up, a young mare named Bess panicked. She stepped over a trace chain, caught her leg, and lunged forward. The domino effect was immediate. 2,000 pounds of terrified muscle slammed into the gelding next to her. Leather snapped like a gunshot. Annie dove out of the way, landing hard in the gravel, narrowly avoiding a hoof that would have crushed her skull like a melon. She sat in the dirt, her ribs aching, watching the tangled mess of frightened horses. The silence of the farm was gone, replaced by the chaotic clatter of iron rings and snorting animals. She tasted blood where she had bitten her lip. "Get up," she whispered to herself. "Get up." She untangled them. She repaired the harness with heavy rivets. She started over. Days bled into nights. Her hands blistered, popped, and formed thick calluses. Her shoulders ached with a deep, grinding pain from lifting heavy collars and throwing leather over towering backs. She learned to speak their language, not with words, but with tension on the lines, the shift of her weight, the tone of her voice. She learned that the big bay, Duke, had to be the lead on the offside, because he set a relentless pace. She learned that Bess needed constant reassurance. By the second week, the town's mockery had become an open spectacle. Locals would slowly drive past the farm, slowing down to watch Annie wrestling with the massive hitch in the practice field. Rumors flew at the diner. She was having a breakdown. She had joined a cult. She was completely bankrupt. Then came the day the wheat was ready. The sun sat low on the horizon, casting long, golden shadows across the amber fields. Annie stood on the platform of the antique binder, holding the heavy leather lines in her bruised hands. The 12 horses stood before her, a living, breathing engine of flesh and bone. The heat radiating from them was palpable. "Step up," Annie commanded, her voice steady. Duke leaned into his collar. The chains pulled taut with a heavy, musical clink. The rest of the team followed, their massive hooves digging into the soil. The binder groaned, its iron wheels turning. The ground drive mechanism engaged, and the sickle bar began to chatter. It worked. The blade sliced through the wheat, the canvas belts catching the stalks, gathering them, tying them into neat bundles, and kicking them out onto the stubble. It was a fraction of the speed of her dead combine. It required her to constantly manage the temperaments of 12 individuals, adjusting the lines, watching for fatigue. But the wheat was coming down. There was no deafening roar of a diesel engine. There was only the rhythmic, percussive thud of 48 hooves, the snorting of breath, the creak of leather, and the metallic clatter of the binder. It was exhausting. It was beautiful. 2 weeks into the harvest, everything changed. It started as a rumor on the AM radio, then escalated into breaking news. A massive supply chain collapse, triggered by overseas conflicts and a catastrophic refinery fire down south, sent fuel prices into a vertical spike. Overnight, diesel rationing began. Annie was out in the field, loading bundles onto a wagon pulled by a 2-horse team, when she noticed the silence. Greg's massive tractors, which usually ran 24 hours a day during harvest, were parked at the edge of his fields. Later that evening, Annie walked down to the mailbox. Greg was standing by his fence line, staring at his idle machinery. His face was pale. "They capped us," Greg said, not looking at her. His voice was hollow, stripped of its usual arrogance. "The co-op. They capped agricultural diesel sales. I can only buy 50 gallons a day. My combine burns that in 3 hours. I've got 1,000 acres left to cut, and it's going to rain next week." He looked at Annie. He looked at the deep hoof prints in the dirt road. "I'm losing the crop, Annie. I'm going to lose it all." Dust coated everything inside the farmhouse, a fine golden powder that tasted of chaff and dried sweat. Annie barely noticed it anymore. She sat at the kitchen table at 3 a.m, taping her cracked fingers with electrical tape. Medical tape wouldn't hold up against the thick leather lines. Her body was a map of bruises, her shoulders carrying a permanent, burning ache. She had dropped 15 pounds in less than a month. Yet, looking at the ledger under the dim yellow light of the kitchen bulb, a strange, feral satisfaction settled in her chest. She was cutting 10 acres a day. It was painfully slow compared to a machine that could devour 50 acres in an afternoon. But every night, she dragged herself out of the field, knowing her operating cost was measured in oats and well water, not diesel at $9 a gallon. The rest of the county was paralyzing. Driving her battered truck into town for a parts run, Annie saw the devastation firsthand. The regional co-op, usually a buzzing hub of harvest activity, looked like a graveyard. Massive green and red combines, machines worth $500,000 each, sat parked in disorganized rows along the highway. Farmers milled around the locked diesel pumps, faces drawn tight with anger and panic. State troopers were stationed by the fuel tanks. Fistfights had broken out twice that week over ration allocations. Men who had laughed at Annie a month ago now stared at her rusted truck with hollow, desperate eyes. They were land-rich, machinery-rich, and entirely impotent. Greg pulled into her yard the following Tuesday. He didn't drive his pristine, heavy-duty pickup this time. He rolled up on a battered four-wheeler, cutting the engine to save the half-gallon in the tank. He looked 10 years older. Deep bags hung under his eyes, and his hands shook as he pulled off his leather work gloves. Annie didn't stop working. She was in the barn, filing the serrated teeth of the binder's sickle bar. The rasp of metal on metal filled the quiet space. Duke and Bess stood in the adjacent stalls, calmly munching Timothy hay, their massive bodies radiating a steady, comforting heat. "I need to buy them," Greg said, his voice stripped of all its former arrogance. He pointed a trembling finger at the stalls. "Name your price, Annie. 50,000. 60. I'll go to the bank right now. I've got 300 acres of beans that are going to shatter in the pods if I don't get them out." "My combine is a brick." Annie paused her filing. She wiped a streak of grease from her cheek with the back of a taped hand. "You don't know how to drive them, Greg. They'd kill you in 10 minutes, or you'd break their wind trying to run them like a John Deere." "I can learn. Annie, please. The bank is going to pull my operating line. If I lose this crop, I lose the farm. 4 generations." "I told you," Annie said, her voice dropping to a low, hard register. "I'm not running a petting zoo, and I'm not a salvage yard for your bad bets. I bought these horses out of a kill pen while you laughed. You bet on the iron. I bet on the blood." "It's just math, Annie," Greg pleaded, repeating Arthur's exact words from weeks ago. "You can buy a whole new farm with what I'll pay you for those beasts. Math is what got you stuck at the fuel pump." Annie tossed the file onto the workbench. It hit with a sharp, final clatter. "Go home, Greg. Pray for a fuel truck." He didn't argue. He just turned and walked back to his four-wheeler, a broken man in a broken system. Annie watched him leave, feeling no triumph. Just a cold, heavy realization of how fragile their entire world actually was. The weather radio crackled to life later that afternoon, spitting static and dread into the barn. A low-pressure system was stalling over the plains. Rain. Heavy, sustained, and unrelenting. If the wheat got soaked in the field before it was cut and shocked, it would rot. She had roughly 48 hours to clear the last 40 acres. 40 acres was 4 days of work for the team. She walked down the aisle of the barn. 12 massive heads turned to watch her, ears swiveling, nostrils flaring to catch her scent. They were tired. She could see it in the slight droop of their heads, the slower, heavier way they shifted their weight. "We got to push," Annie whispered, resting her forehead against Duke's thick neck. The horse let out a long, rumbling sigh, leaning his weight into her. "I know. But we got to push." She harnessed them in the dark. By the time the sun crested the horizon, painting the sky a bruised, threatening purple, the binder was already chattering through the golden stalks. Annie didn't stop for lunch. She didn't stop for water breaks, letting the horses drink from a trough she dragged out to the edge of the field. She worked them relentlessly, feeling the exact limit of their endurance through the leather lines in her hands. She asked for everything they had. And, beneath the darkening sky, the 12 outcasts gave it to her. Rain began to fall just as the heavy, rusted gears of the binder kicked out the very last bundle of wheat. It did not start as a gentle drizzle. The temperature plummeted 20 degrees in a matter of minutes, the air suddenly tasting of ozone and wet dust. Then came the deluge. Fat, freezing drops slammed into the dry earth, kicking up miniature explosions of dirt before instantly turning the topsoil into slick, treacherous mud. Annie stood on the metal platform of the binder, her denim jacket soaking through to her skin in seconds. She was shivering violently, her teeth rattling in her skull, but her eyes were fixed on the fields. They were bare. 300 acres of winter wheat sat safely shocked, tightly bundled, and covered under heavy canvas tarps. Annie wiped a mixture of rain and sweat from her eyes and looked at her team. The 12 Clydesdales were pushed to their absolute physical limits. Duke's head hung low, his massive chest heaving like a bellows. Thick white steam rolled off their backs, rising into the cold downpour, making the team look like they were smoldering from the inside out. She drove them back to the barn in complete silence. The only sound was the heavy, sucking noise of 48 hooves pulling through the deepening mud. Once inside the cavernous space of the main barn, the roar of the storm was muffled by the tin roof. Annie didn't go to the house to dry off. She couldn't. She worked with numb, bleeding fingers, moving down the line to unhitch the team. The wet leather of the heavy collars and trace chains felt like it weighed twice as much. She stripped them down, piece by piece, dropping the soaking harness onto the dirt floor. Grabbing rough burlap feed sacks, she moved from horse to horse, aggressively rubbing down their massive, shivering bodies. Her own muscles screamed in protest. Her fractured rib burned with every motion. She didn't stop until every horse was dry. She hauled heavy buckets of well water. She scooped double rations of rolled oats. She climbed into the loft and threw down the sweetest, greenest alfalfa hay she possessed. Only when the barn was filled with the steady, rhythmic sound of massive jaws grinding grain did Annie finally collapse. She sat on an overturned bucket in the center aisle, leaning her head back against a wooden support beam. Outside, the storm was violently battering the county. Millions of dollars of unharvested beans and wheat on neighboring megafarms were being beaten into worthless rot. Inside, it smelled of wet horsehair, sweet hay, and survival. 2 weeks later, the muddy roads had finally baked dry under a harsh late-autumn sun. Annie dragged a thick, cracked rubber belt from the back of the shed and hooked it up to her ancient backup tractor. It was a machine she only kept around to run the auger, burning a precious 3 gallons of diesel she had manually siphoned from the dead combine. The tractor engine roared, turning the belt that powered the massive stationary thresher sitting in the yard. For 3 days, the farm was a deafening, dusty blur of labor. Annie pitched the dry, cured bundles of wheat into the thresher's maw. The machine violently separated the grain from the chaff, spitting the stalks out the back while a steady, golden stream of hard, red winter wheat poured into her gravity wagons. Arthur's pristine, black luxury sedan crept up her deeply rutted driveway the morning she finished. He stepped out carefully, wincing as his polished leather shoes sank into a patch of drying mud. He wasn't wearing his customary silk tie. His collar was open, his face drawn and pale. Annie leaned heavily against the wooden siding of the barn, a steel pitchfork resting in her calloused, permanently stained hands. "You lost, Arthur?" "Just doing field visits," the banker said, forcing a tight, unconvincing smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Checking on the status of our clients after the rains." "I'm not your client. You denied my equipment loan, remember? Financial suicide, I believe you called it." Arthur cleared his throat, pulling at his collar. He looked past her, his eyes locking onto the towering grain silos, clearly packed to the brim. "Yes. Well, the board is aggressively reassessing our agricultural portfolios in light of the ongoing supply chain disruptions. The diesel rationing has caused catastrophic failures. Many of our largest operations are facing total crop loss. Greg is filing for Chapter 12 bankruptcy protection tomorrow morning." Annie felt a brief flicker of pity for her neighbor, but she ruthlessly smothered it. Pity didn't pay property taxes. "The bank is looking to secure grain contracts," Arthur continued, his tone shifting from his usual authoritative drawl to something bordering on desperate. "Commodity prices have tripled on the Chicago board due to the national shortages. We know you brought your crop in. We'd like to broker a direct sale. Favorable terms, of course. We could even extend a generous line of credit for next season's seed." Annie let out a harsh, scraping laugh. "You want to buy my wheat at a discount to cover the massive losses the bank is taking on everyone else's dead iron. It's just business, Annie." "I already sold it," Annie lied effortlessly, knowing full well she had independent buyers lined up in 3 different states, desperate for any inventory. "And I don't need your credit line. I operate in cash now. And hey," Arthur stared at her. The reality of the shifting power dynamic settled heavily over him. His bank held the worthless paper on millions of dollars of idle machinery, while the exhausted woman standing in dirty boots held the only currency that actually mattered anymore: food. He swallowed hard, nodded stiffly, and retreated to his sedan. Later that afternoon, Annie walked out to the edge of the property line. The gutted, rusted carcass of her broken combine still sat exactly where it had died. Tall weeds were already aggressively growing up through the spokes of the massive rubber tires, reclaiming the machine. Across the barbed wire fence, Greg's fields were a tragic wasteland of flattened, rotting stalks and mud. She heard a heavy, rhythmic thudding approach from behind. Duke trotted up to the fence line, tossing his massive head. His dark eyes were intelligent, calm, and deeply alive. Bess followed close behind, nudging Annie's aching shoulder with a soft, velvet nose. They weren't just a desperate backup plan anymore. They were the beating heart of the acreage. Annie reached out, running her deeply calloused hand along Duke's powerful, muscular neck. She didn't have a new truck. She didn't have a climate-controlled cab, satellite-guided steering, or an app to track her yields. She had blistered, taped hands, a fractured rib that ached when she breathed, and a bank account that was finally, unequivocally, in the black. She looked at the rusting metal corpse of the combine, then turned back to the massive bay gelding. "Come on," Annie said softly, her voice steady in the crisp air. "We've got winter ground to plow. When the world runs out of gas, the ones who remember how to bleed and sweat inherit the earth." If Annie's brutal fight to save her land struck a chord with you, hit that like button and share this story with someone who knows the true value of hard work. Subscribe to our channel for more raw, unapologetic stories from the heartland, where grit always outlasts the machine. Drop a comment below. Could you survive when the engines stop?